Meanwhile, about 2,000 bodies are reported to have been found today in two coastal districts of the Miyagi region. Mike Wooldridge reports.
It was the second explosion in 3 days at the Fukushima nuclear plant, this time in unit number 3, which the authorities have been frantically trying to cool after the system failure in the aftermath of the earthquake and the tsunami it triggered. 11 workers were injured. A similar explosion occurred at the plant's unit number 1 on Saturday, and the power company's warned that it's lost the ability to cool unit number 2. But for now, the authorities are still reassuring the public.
There is a low possibility that a massive amount of radiation has been leaked, but it is similar to the time when the hydrogen explosion took place in number 1 reactor.
It's reported that up to 160 people may have been exposed to radiation. Around 200,000 people have been evacuated from the area as a precaution in recent days. What the authorities are still trying to avert, above all, is a complete meltdown at the plant, which could have far greater consequences. Helicopters are critical in the search for survivors because of the continuing difficulty of getting access to the worst affected areas by roads that are damaged and strewn with debris. Here in Iwate Prefecture, a helicopter brings rescued survivors to safety and to emotional reunions. The worst fear is over for these people, but with the death toll rising rapidly and destruction along such a lengthy stretch of the northeast coastline, it's inevitable that for many the waiting will continue and the anxiety become more acute. Here at the disaster headquarters in the town of Natori, people check the list of the missing and those known to have died. I'm looking for my sister who's been missing for 3 days, says Tadashi Morino. I could not get through and I do not have any news of her. But officials here are cautioning people against holding out too much hope. The total number of victims and missing people has not yet been confirmed, but the number is expected to be very large, he says. It's very difficult to calculate because of the difficulty of confirming people's identity. And that's all too clear from the scene today here at Riku Zentakata, a port of over 20,000 people that was virtually wiped out by the tsunami. The rescuers search for survivors, an increasingly desperate one. Mike Wooldridge, BBC News.
A little earlier, I spoke to the BBC's Chris Hogg, who's in Tokyo, and he described the conditions being faced by many of those who did survive the earthquake and tsunami.
I think it's very hard for a lot of Japanese people to see that so many of their compatriots now are basically suffering what you might call third world conditions, even though this is supposed to be an Asian superpower. You've got hundreds of thousands of people who are homeless now. You've got millions of people who have no access to gas or electricity or even fresh water. And certainly that's what we're hearing from some of the relief agencies that are now helping the government here. There is a need for fresh water, there is a need for blankets. This is a huge, huge disaster, and there is a huge, huge effort being put in place by the Japanese. But it is just the scale of this. It is just enormous. And then, of course, you've got the problems with the nuclear power station, which are making it even worse.
And is there much faith in what the government is saying? Obviously, continued government reassurances about safety.
Well, it's very difficult for people really to get an accurate sense of just how much risk there is. The government making very clear that although there has been radiation leaking out of that plant, they're saying it's at very low levels. But then you see an announcement that the American forces that are helping with the relief effort, they have been moving one of their aircraft carriers further away from the coast because of concerns about low-level radiation. So for those people that are in the evacuation centres outside that exclusion zone, just 20 kilometres from the plant, I'm sure that they're looking at that, and that only adds to their anxiety.
Chris Hogg there in Tokyo. Well, another of our correspondents, Alistair Leathed, is in what remains of Minamisan Riku, the port which was wiped out by the tsunami.
We spent the last 2 days travelling up this coastline, going through towns and villages that have been hit by the tsunami, but nothing on a scale that we've seen here. I mean, it's hard to describe it to you. Just have a look as we are here. In every direction that we look, everything has been pretty much levelled and destroyed. the wall of water that came in from behind me here, actually, because the sea is just here. It must have been 30 or 40 metres high as it went through these main streets. This was a bustling port town, a fishing town, a place that tourists came to, and the water came in and it just destroyed everything. I mean, there's nothing really you can see here that's still standing. That one building there gives quite a lot away, I suppose. It shows that the water was at that height when it surged forward. And these tsunamis, they go in, they go out, they go in, they go out again. And all the way up the road that's now been cleared by the authorities, you can see there's damage either side. There's little inlets like these, little valleys, all the way along this area of coast, and all of them say exactly the same story, and that's buildings, houses, cars. There's a railway track, a whole line has been taken out, the bridges have gone as well. Everything along here has been completely destroyed. They say 10,000 people are missing from here. We thought, well, perhaps many of those got to safety, but for those who didn't get out of this area in time, and they've had at least, 20 minutes was probably all they had to get to high ground, then they would have died here without any doubt. We saw one guy who owned a karaoke bar. His parents were working there, they refused to leave, and he's come back and he's looking for their remains, for their bodies. There's no way they would have survived any of this. Just astonishing, the scale, the area of the devastation here.
Alistair Leithhead with unbelievable pictures from Misanriku, one of the ports devastated by the tsunami. Just to let you know, obviously there are massive international fears now about the whole nuclear power plant safety, and Switzerland, it's reported, has announced plans that it's going to suspend plans to replace its ageing nuclear power plants amid fears of safety, stressing that safety is of utmost priority. The Delhi government has also said they're going to review plans for new buildings, but more on that, of course, as it comes in. Well, of course, these fears are leading to widespread international reviews of the whole question of nuclear safety. And the German Chancellor Angela Merkel has said that safety at all the country's nuclear plants will now be looked at in light of the problems in Japan. She spoke after a large anti-nuclear demonstration took place in Germany. Meanwhile, the Austrian Environment Minister is calling for a stress test of nuclear plants in Brussels. Well, I spoke to our correspondent in Berlin, Steve Evans, who said that events in Japan are having a huge impact in Germany.
The whole anti-nuclear debate has been reopened by the events in Japan. Back in October in the Bundestag, Mrs. Merkel changed government policy. Under the previous government, the idea was that you let the country's existing 17 nuclear power stations live out their nuclear life, and that's it. But she changed the policy to extend their lives until 2035, and that was hugely contentious, very difficult decision to make. But she drove it through and the change was made. That now is up in the air again. She said that she will review the safety standards at the power stations, but she's not saying that she'll revisit the policy. But the argument's different now. On Saturday in Baden-Württemberg, in the southwest of the country, there was a pre-arranged anti-nuclear rally, not expected to make very much at all. In the event of it, though, with the events in Japan fresh off the television screens, tens of thousands of people turned up. That matters for Mrs. Merkel because there's a big election there in 2 weeks' time. The Greens had been making headway anyway against her own party, and her party's controlled that legislature now for decades. So clearly what's happening in Japan does not help Mrs. Merkel or her party in these very important elections that are just about to happen.
Steve Evans there in Berlin. Well, the disaster in Japan has sparked a huge international rescue operation. The United Kingdom and Taiwan have sent search and rescue teams to the worst affected areas. India, Pakistan and the United States have also pledged to help. As Jane O'Brien reports now from Washington.
The magnitude of this disaster is still hard to grasp. Tens of thousands of people are dead or missing, and many, many more are without shelter, food or heat. Japan says it needs all the help it can get, and an international relief effort is already underway. With roads destroyed, much will depend on ships and aircraft to reach the worst affected regions. Helicopters are flying in aid from the USS Ronald Reagan, which joined dozens of Japanese vessels and will be used as a base for delivering supplies to camps in the stricken areas. Other American warships are on the way or standing by. At the request of the Japanese government, seasoned rescue teams from California and Virginia arrived on Sunday with tracker dogs to help search for survivors. Their last international deployment was a year ago in the aftermath of the Haiti earthquake. The 75-person units consist of doctors, paramedics, engineers and firefighters, and have enough food and water to make them self-sufficient for 10 days. And the fundraising has also begun, with international charities calling for the millions of dollars that will be needed in the months and years ahead. Jane O'Brien, BBC News, Washington.
Japan's stock markets plunge on the first day of trading after the disaster, and the central bank injects a record sum. And coping with electricity shortages, Japan faces its first blackouts in 50 years. Hello everybody, I'm Aaron Heselhurst. Welcome to the program. Of course, it's always good to have you with us. Now we'll talk about the power shortages in Japan shortly, but first, the Bank of Japan has stepped in to try and stabilize the country's financial markets by injecting around $180 billion into the banking system. It comes after a senior government official admitted that the economic impact of the disaster could be considerable. Julia Caesar has this report.
A massive sell-off on the Tokyo Stock Exchange wiped out around $287 billion from the market's value, with investors dumping stocks as the country comes to terms with the devastating earthquake.
We think the second quarter of the year, GDP is probably going to be knocked by about 0.5%, maybe as much as 1%. But then as the reconstruction efforts begin, as the government stimulus measures start to take effect, then we think that the economy will start to recover, and by the end of the year it'll be kind of back where it started.
Several of Japan's largest companies have suspended operations, and others are expected to follow this week. Car makers Honda, Nissan and Toyota stopped production shortly after the earthquake hit, as they feared for employee safety. Mitsubishi has also shut down its 3 domestic plants. Sony, Suzuki and Fuji Heavy Industries have also taken similar precautions.
No significant industrial plant has been damaged. The auto manufacturing plants and so on, and the downstream stream of parts and so on is disrupted at present, and there will be disruptions because of the electrical power grid. But I think over the long term, the negative impact on the economy is not going to be as serious as many fear.
The latest estimates put the global insurance bill for Japan's earthquake at $51 billion, but it's predicted that the total economic losses, insurance costs as well as lost productivity, would add up to more than $99 billion.
Last year was the costliest for the international insurance and reinsurance. Certainly the first half of it was, and yet towards the end of it they performed better, and most of the big reinsurers ended last year with a profit despite the Chile earthquake and some of the storm losses that they took in the first half. So it will be a significant event, make no mistake about it, but whether it'll actually be enough to wipe out the entire profits, I'd be a little bit sceptical about that.
The Bank of Japan says it will do its utmost to ensure the stability of its domestic markets. Analysts predicted that the central bank could step in with a fresh round of quantitative easing, especially if the yen surges. Julia Caesar, BBC News.
Well, a warning from the Japanese government that the shutdown of several nuclear reactors is likely to lead to a shortfall in electricity supplies. This, of course, because there was extensive damage to power plants. On top of that, we've had refineries and ports and pipelines really crippled much of the country's infrastructure. And millions of people are still without power in the northeast of Japan. And Tokyo Electric has warned of the country's first major blackouts for half a century.